At the busy train station in Nairobi, Jane Bennett struggled with her suitcase, a burden that represented the emotional weight she had carried since her husband's betrayal. Her trip to Africa was intended as a healing journey, but frustration soon overwhelmed her. Just as she was about to give in, a friendly voice broke through the chaos. "Allow me to assist you," said a tall man with a warm smile. Turning, Jane saw Charles, a local teacher, who easily lifted her suitcase. His confidence soothed her anxiety. His English was flawless, his accent pleasant and clear. "It seems like you've had a tiring day," he remarked. Jane nodded, a reluctant smile appearing. "You could say that." As they walked toward the platform, Charles initiated a conversation, discussing the city's rich history, vibrant culture, and his work with children. Jane relaxed, captivated by his enthusiasm. "What brings you here?" he inquired. Jane paused before answering. "I guess I'm searching for something or trying to escape something." Charles didn't pry, instead offering helpful tips about the area, suggesting places to see and avoid. Jane was surprised by his kindness toward a stranger. When she asked about his willingness to help, he simply replied, "Kindness costs nothing, but it can mean everything to someone." Boarding the train, Jane felt thankful for his company. Even for a short time, they sat across from one another, the rhythmic sound of the train acting as a backdrop to their conversation. Jane ended up sharing more about her life than she had planned, her late husband's betrayal, her choice to embrace solitude, and her journey to rediscover herself. Charles listened intently, his dark eyes filled with understanding. He shared bits of his own story, his disappointments, yet unyielding hope. Jane admired his resilience. By the time they reached their destination, Jane felt a shift within her. For the first time in years, she felt lighter. The stranger's kindness, his capacity to listen without judgment, and the warmth he radiated instilled a small seed of trust in her heart. As they parted for the night, Charles looked back and said, "Sometimes journeys surprise us in ways we don't expect. I hope this one does for you." Jane watched him leave, a flicker of hope stirring within her, something she hadn't felt in ages. As Jane and Charles spent more time together, an undeniable connection began to blossom. They enjoyed quiet moments and conversations that lingered longer than expected. Jane began to look forward to their time, whether they were talking or sitting in comfortable silence. The dynamic between them started to change from mere friendship to something deeper, an acknowledgement Jane wasn't ready to label. Charles noticed this shift too, as he admired Jane's quiet strength and resilience. At 65, she exuded a grace and wisdom born from years of surviving heartache and confronting life's challenges. Yet, behind that composure, he sensed her vulnerability. Although she rarely spoke about her late husband, when she did, he could see the pain etched in her eyes. Despite the warmth between them, Jane remained cautious. The scars of her past were still fresh, and while Charles was kind and caring, he was still unfamiliar. She found herself questioning whether her feelings for him stemmed from loneliness or something deeper. One evening by the lake, as they watched the sunset, Jane pondered the developing intimacy between them. This attraction was unexpected and almost unsettling. Charles had a gentle way about him that made her feel safe, an emotion that had eluded her for a long time. Charles too found himself increasingly drawn to Jane in ways he hadn't foreseen. He admired her wisdom, strength, and warmth. There was a common quality to her that eased his own unresolved pain. He recognized that he enjoyed her company beyond mere obligation or friendship. Neither of them voiced these feelings. Their bond was growing quietly, subtly, with an unspoken understanding of their mutual care for each other. They hesitated to confront the complexities that their unacknowledged feelings could bring. But with each shared moment, it became more evident that Jane and Charles were no longer just strangers on a journey. They were two souls intertwining in ways they had never anticipated. The atmosphere between Jane and Charles shifted after their arrival in the city. What had started as an innocent companionship now felt more complicated. Jane had noticed something that unsettled her. Charles had run into an old acquaintance, a woman named Lucia. The brief exchange between them was friendly, but loaded with familiarity. Jane couldn't ignore the pang of jealousy that twisted in her chest. It was strange. She didn't have a right to feel that way. Yet the unease lingered. The next few days were filled with awkwardness. Jane observed how Lucia and Charles interacted. There was an ease between them, a history Jane couldn't ignore. She tried to push the feelings aside, telling herself it was just her insecurities coming to the surface. But each time Lucia appeared, Jane felt the distance grow between her and Charles. One afternoon, as they sat in a cafe, Jane watched Charles and Lucia talk animatedly, as if no time had passed since they last met. There was something in the way Lucia smiled at Charles that made Jane feel like an outsider. She tried to dismiss it, but it was hard not to feel like she was intruding on something that belonged to them, something Jane had no place in. When Charles finally returned to her, he seemed distracted. He apologized for the length of the conversation with Lucia, explaining that they had once been close. Jane nodded, forcing a smile. But inside, she felt a knot tighten in her stomach. Something was happening, and she couldn't quite put her finger on it. That night, Jane confronted Charles. She couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine when the situation felt far from it. She demanded to know what was going on between him and Lucia. The words tumbled out more harshly than she intended, but the hurt had built up, and now it was spilling over. Charles seemed taken aback, trying to explain, but his words didn't ease her pain. "She's just an old friend," he said. But Jane wasn't convinced. She wanted to believe him, but everything inside her screamed that there was more to the story. "I don't want to be part of some messy situation," Jane said, her voice wavering. "I don't want to be a distraction to you." Charles reached for her hand, but Jane pulled away. It wasn't just the jealousy that made her withdraw. It was the realization that she had allowed herself to care for him more than she had planned. And now, seeing him with Lucia, the walls she had built around her heart began to crumble. "I never meant for this to happen," Charles said softly. "But I don't want you to leave." Jane's heart ached, but she knew something had shifted, whether it was her own insecurities or the reality of the situation. She couldn't ignore the doubt that had settled in her chest, needed space to think, to understand what was happening between them. The next day, Jane made a decision. She would continue her journey alone, away from the complexity of her feelings for Charles. She packed her things in silence, unable to look at him without feeling a mixture of hurt and longing. Charles tried to stop her, but Jane was resolute. There was too much confusion now, too much uncertainty. She had been betrayed before, and the possibility of it happening again was too much to bear. She had to walk away, even if it meant leaving something that might have been beautiful, something she had begun to believe in. As she left, Charles stood there watching her go, a deep regret in his eyes. He hadn't meant to hurt her, but in his failure to be honest with her, he had. And now, he realized it might be too late to undo the damage. Days passed, and Jane couldn't shake the sense of loss that followed her after leaving Charles. The journey she had set out on, to find peace, now felt hollow. Her heart was heavy with unanswered questions, and the memory of their shared moments lingered like a shadow. She had tried to distance herself from the pain, but the connection they had shared refused to fade. Even though she had walked away, A part of her still wished for the warmth he had brought into her life. Meanwhile, Charles was consumed by regret. The space between them felt like an unbridgeable chasm. He had thought he could manage his feelings, that he could simply help Jane without becoming attached. But he was wrong. The moment she left, he realized just how deeply he had grown to care for her. His failure to communicate, to be honest about the lingering feelings he had for her, had caused irreparable damage. His regret wasn't just about losing her, it was about betraying her trust. Charles spent hours reflecting on what had gone wrong. He realized that in his hesitance to confront his own feelings, he had pushed Jane away. He had been so wrapped up in the past, in Lucia and the history they shared, that he hadn't recognized what was blossoming before him. He missed Jane, her laughter, her presence, the way she saw the world. It was too late now, but he couldn't let her go without trying to make amends. He wrote her a letter, pouring his heart out. In it, he explained his feelings, apologized for the confusion and the hurt he had caused. He confessed that his silence wasn't about indifference, but about his own fear. Fear of opening himself up to something that might hurt him again. But he knew now that he couldn't let her slip away without doing everything in his power to fix things. Jane received the letter on a quiet afternoon, and as she read it, a familiar ache settled in her chest. The words spoke of regret, of vulnerability, of a man who had been too afraid to admit his own feelings for a long time. She simply sat with the letter in her hands, unsure of how to respond. There was a part of her that wanted to close herself off completely, to protect her heart from the possibility of further pain. But there was another part of her, one that had seen the kindness in Charles, the part that had shared in the tenderness of their moments together, that couldn't simply turn her back on him. The following morning, Jane went to the art gallery where they had shared some of their most intimate moments. She had made a decision. It wasn't about forgetting the hurt, but about allowing herself to move beyond it. She had come to realize that love, though complicated, was something worth taking risks for, even if it meant stepping into the unknown once again. When they met, there were no words at first. They simply looked at each other, each of them carrying the weight of their shared history and the unspoken feelings that had bloomed between them. Charles, vulnerable and open, spoke first. "I've spent so many days regretting how I treated you," he said softly, "but I want to make it right. I want to try again. I want us to see where this could go." Jane, her heart conflicted, finally spoke. "I don't know if I can forget the hurt, Charles, but I'm willing to see where this can go too, if you're willing to fight for it." They both understood that love wasn't just about the moments of joy, but about working through the pain, the misunderstandings, and the fears. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. They had both been through enough to understand that sometimes the hardest thing to do is to allow yourself to love again, despite the risks. As they walked side by side, no longer strangers or hesitant companions, but partners, Jane knew that this journey was only just beginning. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long time, she believed in the possibility of a new chapter, one filled with trust, growth, and maybe a love that could heal them both.